I am Denise, a 68-year-old retired school librarian from Portland. For 40 years, I've been married to Frank, a retired accountant who just turned 70 last month. Every year since our third anniversary, he's taken a month-long fishing trip with his college buddies. I was never invited. Last week, while cleaning his study, I found a hidden photo album that changed everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Before I tell you how my entire marriage crumbled in one afternoon, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and subscribe to hear more stories about trust and betrayal. Frank and I met at a college mixer back in 1980. I was studying library sciences and he was finishing his accounting degree. He wasn't like the other guys who were loud and showing off. Frank stood quietly by the punch bowl, observing everyone with those thoughtful blue eyes that I fell for immediately. When he finally approached me, he asked about the book I had tucked under my arm, rather than offering some cheesy pickup line. That night, we talked for hours about our favorite authors and our dreams for the future. Our courtship was simple and sweet. Frank would pick me up in his used Volkswagen, and we'd drive to the lake for picnics or attend free concerts in the park. He wasn't flashy with grand gestures, but he was consistent and kind. After dating for 2 years, he proposed during a walk through the autumn leaves at our favorite park. No fancy ring, just a sincere promise to build a life together. We married in a small ceremony at my parents' backyard in 1982. Our honeymoon was a weekend at a nearby bed and breakfast because we were saving for a down payment on our first home. Frank was always practical about money, which I admired. Within 3 years, we had purchased a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet Portland neighborhood where we would spend the next 4 decades of our lives. Frank quickly established himself at an accounting firm, eventually becoming a partner. I secured a position as the librarian at Roosevelt Elementary School, where I worked for 35 years until my retirement. We settled into a comfortable routine that felt safe and predictable. Weekday mornings, Frank would make the coffee while I prepared breakfast. Evenings, I would cook dinner while he balanced our checkbook or worked on household projects. Early in our marriage, we decided not to have children. Frank had a genetic condition that carried a 50% chance of being passed down, and he didn't want to risk it. Though I had always imagined myself as a mother, I respected his decision and found fulfillment in working with children at the school. We became the favorite aunt and uncle to our nieces and nephews instead. The fishing trips began in our 3rd year of marriage. Frank came home one evening more animated than usual, saying his college roommate Ted had invited him on a month-long fishing expedition to Minnesota. I was surprised at the length, but encouraged him to go. He deserved a break from his demanding job, and I thought it would be good for him to reconnect with old friends. When he returned from that first trip, he was relaxed and rejuvenated in a way I had never seen before. He shared stories about massive catches, campfire conversations, and the peaceful mornings on the lake. Though he had few photos to show his enthusiasm was contagious. I was happy for him, even as I felt a small pang of exclusion. The next year, the fishing trip became an established tradition. Frank would circle the dates on our calendar months in advance, researching fishing gear and calling his buddies to plan. Each year, I noticed his excitement building as his departure date approached. He would pack meticulously, checking and rechecking his equipment. After the 5th annual trip, I suggested joining him the following year. "I could bring books and relax while you fish," I offered. Frank immediately tensed up. "It's not set up for women, Denise. The cabin is primitive and the guys, well, they wouldn't be comfortable with a woman there. They use these trips to talk about things they can't say around their wives." I accepted his explanation, though it stung. As the years passed, I suggested alternative vacations we could take together. "We could go to the Grand Canyon," I said one year, "or maybe drive up the California coast." Frank always had practical reasons to decline. "We're saving for retirement," he would remind me. "Those tourist destinations are overpriced and crowded. Our major life celebrations were always local affairs. For our 10th anniversary dinner at the nicest restaurant in Portland. For our 25th, a weekend at the Oregon coast." For his 50th birthday, a surprise party at our home with local friends. For 40 years, I accepted that travel simply wasn't a priority for Frank, except for his sacred fishing trips. Looking back, there were signs I should have questioned more deeply. The fishing trips began in May for the first decade or so. Then suddenly, without explanation, Frank shifted them to September one year. When I asked about the change, he mumbled something about better fishing conditions. I accepted his answer without pressing further. Phone calls during his trips were sporadic and brief. "The reception is terrible out here," he would explain. Sometimes I would hear strange background noises that didn't sound like a remote fishing cabin. Once I distinctly heard an announcement in what sounded like an airport, but when I asked, Frank quickly said it was just the radio. When Frank returned from these trips, he would sometimes have strange tan lines, not consistent with this of fishing in Minnesota or Michigan. His nose and arms would be deeply tanned, but in patterns that suggested resort lounging rather than fishing. When I commented once, he said, "We took the boat out every day. You know how the sun reflects off the water." The souvenirs he brought back occasionally slipped up his story. Once he presented me with a decorative bowl that looked distinctly southwestern in design. When I questioned if they had taken a detour to Arizona, he quickly said one of the guys had picked it up on a different trip and thought I would like it. Our friends would sometimes make odd comments. Once at a dinner party, our neighbor Bob asked Frank about a fishing spot he'd recommended. Frank looked momentarily confused before recovering and offering vague details. Another time, someone asked to see pictures from his fishing trips, and Frank became defensive, saying he was too busy fishing to take photos. The financial aspects of these trips also raised questions I tried to ignore. Frank insisted on maintaining a separate bank account for what he called his personal expenses. While we shared the main household account, this separate account was off limits to me. "Every man needs some financial privacy," he would say when I asked. I noticed significant withdrawals before his fishing trips amounts that seemed excessive for a rustic cabin experience. About 15 years into our marriage, I tried to surprise Frank by joining him on a trip. I had contacted Ted, planning to show up at their cabin for just 2 days. Ted sounded confused on the phone, saying he needed to check the plans and would get back to me. He never did. When I mentioned this to Frank later, he became uncharacteristically angry, accusing me of trying to intrude on the one thing that was just for him. As the decades passed, I noticed our social circle shifting. Couples we had been close with for years gradually drifted away. When we did get together, there was sometimes an uncomfortable tension I couldn't explain. Some of Frank's work colleagues would avoid eye contact with me at office parties, and their wives would be overly solicitous, as if compensating for something. Once I overheard someone at a company Christmas party say to their spouse, "That's her, that's Frank's wife." The tone held something like pity. When I turned around, they quickly changed the subject. These moments accumulated over the years, little splinters of doubt that I pushed down because confronting them was too painful to consider. My self-confidence gradually eroded. I began to question my attractiveness, my intelligence, my worth as a partner. Why wasn't I enough for Frank to want to travel with me? Was I imagining these inconsistencies? Frank would often dismiss my concerns with phrases like, "You're being paranoid, Denise," or "Why do you always have to overthink everything?" I tried to fill the void by diving deeper into my work at the school, volunteering for additional responsibilities, and forming close relationships with my colleagues. They became my support system, especially during Frank's annual absences. Still, I never shared my deeper doubts with them, maintaining the facade of our perfect marriage. With each passing year, the distance between us grew almost imperceptible to outsiders, but painfully real to me. We operated like well-oiled machinery, moving around each other in practiced patterns, but the emotional intimacy had faded. I told myself this was normal for long-term marriages. I convinced myself that stability and security were adequate compensation for the growing hollowness I felt. Last September, Frank left for his 40th annual fishing trip. After 4 decades, the departure routine was well established. I drove him to the airport where he would supposedly meet Ted and the others for their flight to Minnesota. He kissed me goodbye with his usual quick peck and reminded me not to wait up when he called during the trip. With Frank gone and the house empty, I decided to tackle some deep cleaning projects I had been putting off. Our home had accumulated 40 years of memories and just as much dust. I started in the living room and worked my way through each space, methodically sorting through belongings and organizing as I went. A week into my cleaning project, I reached Frank's study. He had always been particular about this room, preferring to clean it himself. "My papers are organized in a specific system," he would say whenever I offered to dust the shelves. Now, with him gone for 3 more weeks, I decided a thorough cleaning wouldn't hurt. I began with the bookshelves, carefully removing each accounting text and business journal to dust behind them. When I reached his desk, I cleaned around his computer and organized the scattered papers. The large oak filing cabinet in the corner was next. I had opened the top 2 drawers many times before to file tax documents or insurance papers. The bottom drawer, however, had always been locked. I had never given it much thought, assuming it contained sensitive client information from his accounting practice. That day, as I ran the duster along the side of the cabinet, I noticed a small key taped to the underside of the top drawer. Curiosity got the better of me. I removed the key and stared at the locked drawer for several long moments. In 40 years of marriage, I had never invaded Frank's privacy this way. But something compelled me forward, a culmination of 4 decades of small doubts and unanswered questions. My hand trembled slightly as I inserted the key and turned it. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing not client documents, but a large leather-bound album and several small boxes. With a growing sense of unease, I lifted out the album and carried it to Frank's desk. The leather cover was expensive and well-worn, like something handled frequently and with care. When I opened to the first page, my world collapsed. There was Frank, much younger, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. His arm was wrapped around a beautiful woman with long, dark hair who was not me. They were both beaming at the camera, the Paris lights twinkling behind them. The date carefully noted in Frank's precise handwriting, May 1985, our 3rd year of marriage, his first fishing trip. My hand shook as I turned page after page. Frank and this woman in Rome posing by the Colosseum. Frank and her on a beach in Hawaii sunset, turning the sky crimson behind them. Frank and her in a gondola in Venice. Tokyo, Barcelona, the Greek islands. 40 years of destinations spanning every continent except Antarctica. 40 years of annual vacations while I sat at home believing he was in a rustic cabin with fishing rods. The woman aged along with Frank throughout the photos, her dark hair eventually streaked with silver, her face gaining gentle lines around the eyes and mouth. But in every photo they looked blissfully happy. In some they were dressed elegantly for dinner. In others they wore hiking gear in front of majestic mountains. They posed with scuba equipment by crystal blue waters and sat bundled up watching the northern lights. Between the photo pages were ticket stubs, hotel receipts, and small mementos, pressed flowers, museum passes, a collection of beautiful moments carefully preserved. At the back of the album was an envelope containing dozens of handwritten letters. With numb fingers, I opened the first one. "My darling Julia," it began. "Another year until I can hold you in my arms again. These separations are unbearable, but the thought of our month together keeps me going. Thank you for understanding our arrangement. Your patience and love mean everything to me. Julia." Even her name felt like a knife to my heart. I read letter after letter, learning that she was a travel photographer who had been Frank's college girlfriend before me. They had never broken up. Instead, when he met me, he had somehow convinced both of us to accept different parts of his life. She got the adventures and passion. I got the daily routine and stability. Most devastating were the letters from Julia that Frank had kept. "I know it's complicated," she wrote in one. "Sometimes I wish I had you all to myself. But I understand you care for Denise in your way, and the life you've built there serves a purpose for you. I treasure our time together and live for our September adventures." The shock gave way to physical symptoms. My stomach heaved, and I barely made it to the bathroom before becoming violently ill. I sat on the cold tile floor, my entire body trembling, trying to process what I had discovered. The room spun around me as 40 years of memories rearranged themselves into a new and terrible pattern. After hours of cycling through disbelief, nausea, and uncontrollable tears, I returned to the study. I needed to understand the full extent of the deception. The small boxes in the drawer contained more evidence: jewelry receipts for items I had never received, photos of a seaside cottage that appeared in multiple vacation shots, a small velvet box containing a diamond ring far more expensive than the modest band on my finger. The magnitude of the betrayal was incomprehensible. While I scrimped and saved proud of our responsible financial planning, Frank had been funding a lavish parallel life. While I longed for just one real vacation with my husband, he had been traveling the world with another woman. While I believed in our exclusive commitment, he had maintained 2 relationships for our entire marriage. After the initial shock subsided, a cold determination took over. If Frank had maintained this deception for 40 years, there would be more evidence beyond this hidden album. I needed to understand the full scope of his betrayal before confronting him. I created a detailed timeline from the album, noting each destination and date. The pattern was clear. For the first decade, the trips were in May, then switched to September. Looking at our life events, I realized the change coincided with my mother's illness and death in May of that year. Frank had rescheduled his annual rendezvous out of necessity, not consideration for me. With trembling hands, I turned to my computer and searched for Julia Travel Photographer. The search returned thousands of results, but I quickly narrowed it down when I added Frank's name. There she was, Julia Winters, an award-winning travel photographer whose work had been featured in prestigious magazines. Her professional website included a biography mentioning her extensive travels and her base in San Francisco. Her social media accounts were filled with stunning landscapes and cultural photography. Interspersed were occasional personal photos, including some with Frank, that were framed carefully to look like casual encounters with a friend met during travels. To anyone else, they might appear innocent. To me, with my new knowledge, the intimate glances and body language were unmistakable. I found myself scrolling through years of her posts, seeing glimpses of the exciting life she and Frank shared. In one photo caption from 3 years ago, she wrote, "Another magical September comes to an end. Grateful for these precious moments that sustain me through the year." The comments included one from a private account with only Frank's initials as the username, "Until next time, my love." My research revealed that Julia had built a successful career documenting their travels, turning their annual affair into professional content. Some of her most acclaimed photo series had been taken in locations I now knew she had visited with my husband. Frank had effectively funded her career while keeping me in the dark about our actual financial situation. With shaking hands, I dialed Ted's number, Frank's supposed fishing buddy. We had met several times over the decades at various social gatherings. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice wary when I identified myself. "Ted, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," I said, working to keep my voice steady. "When was the last time you and Frank actually went fishing?" The long silence told me everything before he even spoke. "Denise, this isn't something I should get involved in. Please, Ted. 40 years of my life, I deserve the truth." He sighed heavily. "We stopped the annual fishing trips after the first 5 years. The guys all had young kids demanding jobs. It became impossible to coordinate." His voice grew quieter. "Frank asked us to cover for him if you ever called or asked questions. I'm sorry, Denise. Many of us felt uncomfortable, but he was our friend." I thanked him and hung up another piece of the puzzle falling into place. For 35 years, there hadn't even been a group of fishing buddies. Just Frank and Julia, while an entire network of people maintained his lie. Unable to stop myself, I dug through our financial records. Frank had always handled our money, giving me monthly updates that I trusted without verification. Now I pulled bank statements, tax returns, investment accounts. I found evidence of a separate account in his name that had regular large withdrawals before each September. The amounts had increased over the years from a few $1,000s to nearly $15,000 for the most recent trip. I calculated roughly how much he had spent on these lavish annual vacations over 40 years. The total made me physically ill. We could have had a significantly more comfortable retirement. We could have helped my niece when she struggled to pay for college. All those years of Frank insisting we needed to be frugal, to save diligently for our future, while he siphoned off funds for his alternate life. In a moment of clarity, I realized I needed professional help. I contacted a private investigator recommended by a former colleague whose sister had gone through a difficult divorce. The PI was efficient and discreet. For a fee that made me wince, but that I paid from my personal savings, he agreed to confirm Frank's current whereabouts. 3 days later, the PI sent me digital photos that confirmed my worst fears. There was Frank, my husband of 40 years, walking hand in hand with Julia along a white sand beach in Santorini. They were staying at an exclusive cliffside resort that cost more per night than I spent on groceries in a month. The PI's report included details about their timeshare property in Bordeaux, France, which they visited each year as part of their September travels. Most devastating was the list of mutual friends who apparently knew about Frank's double life. Names jumped out at me: couples we had dinner with regularly, Frank's colleagues. I had considered my friends even our next-door neighbors of 20 years. The PI had traced connections through social media and found evidence that several of these people had met up with Frank and Julia during their travels over the years. The betrayal extended far beyond my husband. An entire community had participated in deceiving me, treating me with pity behind my back while smiling to my face. The humiliation burned as deeply as the hurt. How many dinner parties had I hosted where guests later laughed about foolish, oblivious Denise? How many sympathetic looks had been exchanged when I mentioned Frank's fishing trips? As the evidence mounted, my shock and heartbreak began to transform into something else. A slow-burning anger took root, strengthening my resolve. Frank would return in 2 weeks, expecting to find his dutiful wife waiting ready to hear fabricated stories about fish that were never caught. But this time, things would be very different. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for Frank's return with methodical precision. First, I made copies of all the evidence and stored them in a safe deposit box at a bank where we didn't have an account. I took photos of every page in the album and backed them up in multiple locations. Whatever happened next, Frank wouldn't be able to destroy the evidence or gaslight me into thinking I had imagined it all. I consulted with a divorce attorney, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Barbara, who listened to my story without visible shock, though her eyes softened with sympathy. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first time I've heard something like this," she said. "At your age, and with the length of your marriage, you're entitled to significant support. Let's discuss your options." Barbara helped me understand my legal rights and financial position. We gathered documentation of all marital assets and liabilities. She explained that Frank's deceptive financial behavior could impact the divorce settlement in my favor. "Judges don't look kindly on spouses who hide assets or maintain secret accounts," she explained. I secured my personal finances, opening new accounts in my name only and transferring my inheritance from my parents, which had remained separate from our joint funds. I made copies of important documents, birth certificates, property deeds, and insurance policies. Barbara advised me to document the contents of our home with photos and videos in case disagreements arose during property division. The day before Frank was due to return, I called my closest friend Linda, the one person I was certain hadn't been part of the deception since she had moved to Portland only 5 years ago. "I need you to be on standby tomorrow," I told her. "I can't explain everything now, but I may need a place to stay or just someone to be with me." The morning of Frank's return, I set the stage. I placed the photo album in the center of our dining room table, along with printed copies of the PI's report and financial records showing the separate account. I dressed carefully in an outfit that made me feel confident, applied makeup, and styled my hair. This confrontation would happen on my terms. When I heard Frank's key in the lock at precisely 4 in the afternoon, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he would hear it. He called out cheerfully, as he always did, "Denise, I'm home." I heard him set down his luggage in the entryway and hang his coat in the closet, following the routine of 40 years. I remained seated at the dining room table, the album open to a recent photo of him and Julia in front of the Santorini sunset. When he walked into the room, his face registered confusion, then recognition, and finally dread as he realized what he was seeing. "Denise, I can explain," he began, his voice faltering. 40 years, Frank," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. 40 years of lies. He stood frozen for a moment before his expression shifted, hardening from dread to defiance. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said, as if my discovery was the offense rather than his betrayal. "Clearly," I replied. "Tell me about Julia." Hearing me say her name seemed to deflate him. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "It's complicated. I have nothing but time for you to uncomplicate it," I said. Over the next hour, Frank revealed the full extent of his deception. He and Julia had been college sweethearts before he met me. When his career path led him to Portland, Julia, already pursuing photography, refused to give up her dreams to follow him. Instead of breaking up or committing to a long-distance relationship, they devised this arrangement. "She got my passion, and you got my stability," he said, as if this explained everything. "I needed both lives to be happy." "And what about what I needed?" I asked, my voice finally breaking. "Did that ever factor into your equations?" Frank had the audacity to look offended. "I gave you a good life, Denise. A nice home, financial security. Many women would be grateful for that." "A good life built on lies," I countered. "All those times I wanted to travel with you to experience the world together. You were content with your books and your school," he interrupted. "Julia needed adventure. She inspired my soul in ways you never could. Each word was a fresh wound. So I was just the convenient housewife, the reliable backdrop for your real life." "You had a good life, didn't you?" he asked defensively. "We had a nice home, friend stability. Friends who knew you were deceiving me, who pitied me behind my back." I pushed the PI's report toward him, showing the list of mutual acquaintances who were aware of his double life. Frank at least had the grace to look ashamed about this. Not all of them knew everything. Some just thought Julia was an old friend I met up with occasionally. "And the money, Frank. All those years you insisted we needed to be frugal, while you spent thousands on luxury vacations?" He shrugged. "I worked hard. I deserve some pleasure in my life." That's when a terrible thought occurred to me. "When exactly did you take these trips each year?" His hesitation told me he knew the significance of the question. "It varied." "Tell me, Frank, the exact dates." He looked away. "Usually the first 2 weeks of September and the last 2 weeks of August." The dates registered with sickening clarity. "Our anniversary is August 28th. You've been with her on our anniversary every year, haven't you?" His silence was confirmation enough. For 40 years, while I celebrated our anniversary with a small gift, and perhaps dinner at a local restaurant before or after his trip, Frank had been marking the occasion with Julia in exotic locations around the world. "I want you to leave," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "Tonight. Pack what you need for now. My attorney will contact you about the rest." Frank stared at me in disbelief. "This is my house too. You can't just throw me out." "Actually, she can," said a voice from the doorway. We both turned to see Linda standing there. I had texted her when I heard Frank's key in the lock, and she had let herself in with the spare key she had for emergencies. "I'm a witness to what's happened here, Frank. I think you should respect Denise's wishes." Frank looked from Linda to me, seeming to realize the extent of my preparations. Finally, wordlessly, he stood up and went upstairs. I heard him moving around, opening drawers, the familiar sounds now painful reminders of our shared life. Linda sat with me, holding my hand as we waited. When Frank came downstairs with 2 large suitcases, he paused in the dining room doorway. "Julia and I are flying to San Francisco tomorrow," he said as if this information was relevant to me. "I'll be staying at her place until things are settled." "Goodbye, Frank," I said, not trusting myself to say more. Linda walked him to the door. I heard murmured voices, then the sound of his car starting. From the dining room window, I watched as he drove away, several neighbors pausing their yard work to stare as the mundane scene of Frank loading luggage into his car took on the weight of 4 decades collapsing. When he was gone, the house felt both emptier and somehow lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The days following Frank's departure passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Moments of empowering anger would give way to crushing grief, then to periods of numbness where I moved through the house like a ghost. Linda stayed with me that first night, and my niece Alice came for the weekend, bringing her quiet strength and practical support. I gave myself permission to feel everything. On the third day, I took every framed photo of Frank and me and placed them in a box in the garage. I couldn't bear to destroy them yet, but I couldn't look at them either, knowing each smile might have been photographed just weeks before or after he was with Julia. Our friends and neighbors reacted in various ways as news of our separation spread. Some expressed shock and disbelief, genuinely unaware of Frank's double life. Others offered awkward condolences that revealed their prior knowledge. "I never thought you'd find out," one woman said, immediately realizing her mistake from my expression. These friends I cut from my life without explanation or apology. A week after Frank left, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "From Julia." My finger hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won out. The message was surprisingly direct. "Denise, I won't insult you with apologies that can't possibly be adequate. Frank told me you discovered our relationship. What we did was wrong, and you deserved better. I won't defend my choices or ask for your forgiveness. I just want you to know that Frank never spoke unkindly of you. He portrayed you as intelligent and kind, if somewhat complacent. I realize now that his characterization served to justify our behavior. If you ever want to talk, I'm willing to answer any questions you might have." She had signed it simply Julia, with her phone number below. I never responded, but kept the email as further evidence for the divorce proceedings. The legal process moved forward with painful slowness. Frank initially tried to hide assets and minimize his financial obligations. Barbara, my attorney, was relentless in exposing his attempts. When he claimed the separate account contained money from a private inheritance, she produced documentation showing regular transfers from our joint account. When he understated the value of his retirement accounts, she subpoenaed the complete records. What Frank hadn't counted on was my methodical nature and attention to detail traits honed through decades of library work. I had records of everything filed neatly away in case they were ever needed. Each time he made a false claim, I could produce evidence to contradict it. Eventually, his attorney advised him to stop contesting and agree to a fair settlement. The divorce process forced me to confront financial realities I had avoided. I learned that Frank had significantly understated our retirement savings in his regular updates to me. There was more money than I had believed, even accounting for what he had spent on his parallel life. This discovery was both a relief and a fresh betrayal, evidence that he had been preparing for the possibility of this very situation. Throughout this period, I began therapy with Dr. Karen Marshall, a specialist in betrayal trauma. "What you're experiencing isn't just heartbreak," she explained during our first session. "It's a profound breach of trust that affects your sense of reality. Everything you thought you knew about your life has been called into question." Dr. Marshall helped me process the complex emotions, the anger at Frank, the self-doubt about how I could have missed the signs, the humiliation of being pitied by friends, and the fear of starting over at 68. "You're grieving multiple losses," she said. "The loss of your marriage, your history, your planned future, and your sense of what was real." Through therapy, I began to reconnect with the woman I had been before meeting Frank, rediscovering interests and aspects of my personality that had been subsumed in my role as his wife. I joined a book club at the local library, finding comfort in literature as I always had. One of the members, Jennifer, was going through a divorce after 30 years of marriage. Though the circumstances were different, our shared experience of rebuilding in our 60s created an instant bond. I also reconnected with former colleagues from the school who had no connection to Frank. These women rallied around me, including me in their weekend brunches and movie nights. Their uncomplicated support helped me remember that not everyone in my life had been part of the deception. Gradually, I began to reclaim my space. I rearranged furniture that had remained in the same position for decades. I painted the kitchen the sunny yellow Frank had always vetoed as too bright. I converted his study into a reading room, removing all traces of his presence. The most significant challenge was learning to trust my own judgment again. For months, I second-guessed every decision, haunted by how completely I had been deceived for 40 years. Dr. Marshall worked with me on this specifically. Frank's successful deception wasn't due to your failure, she reminded me. It was the result of his deliberate, calculated efforts and the collusion of others. 6 months after finding the photo album, I took my first solo trip a weekend at a coastal bed and breakfast 2 hours from Portland. It was a small step but significant. I walked alone on the beach, dined alone, at a nice restaurant, and slept alone in an unfamiliar bed. Each activity that initially felt uncomfortable gradually became empowering. As news of our divorce became public knowledge, I was surprised by how many women reached out to me, some merely acquaintances sharing their own stories of betrayal and deception. I realized that my willingness to speak openly about what had happened was giving others permission to do the same. This unexpected purpose helped transform my pain into something meaningful. 1 year after discovering Frank's secret life, our divorce was finalized. The settlement was fair, largely due to Barbara's skilled representation and Frank's eventual desire to avoid a public trial where all details would be entered into court records. I received half of our considerable assets, the house, and ongoing alimony due to the length of our marriage and Frank's deceptive financial behavior. With financial security established, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to sell our house. Despite the renovations and redecorating, the space held too many memories of a life that had been fundamentally untrue. Every room contained echoes of conversations, moments, and plans built on Frank's lies. I purchased a small cottage near the Oregon coast, fulfilling a dream I had mentioned to Frank decades ago that he had dismissed as impractical. The cottage needed work, but overseeing the renovations gave me purpose and a creative outlet. I chose every fixture, every paint color, every piece of furniture myself, creating a space that reflected only my taste and preferences. With part of the divorce settlement, I did something Frank would have never approved. I booked a 2-week trip to Italy, the first stamp in a passport I had obtained after our separation. I chose Italy because it appeared repeatedly in Frank's album with Julia, but I was determined to create my own memories there, untainted by their shadow. The trip terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. At 69, I was navigating foreign train schedules, ordering meals in broken Italian, and finding my way through ancient streets alone. On my 3rd day in Rome, feeling overwhelmed in a crowded piazza, I was approached by a group of women roughly my age who recognized my lost expression. "First time in Italy?" one of them asked kindly. When I nodded, she introduced herself as Margaret and invited me to join their small tour group for the afternoon. These 5 women, all traveling without partners, for various reasons, became my unexpected companions for much of the trip. We shared meals, split taxi fares, and helped each other navigate the complexities of international travel. Margaret was widowed, Judy divorced, Susan single by choice, Patricia traveling while her husband recovered from surgery at home, and Helen celebrating her retirement. Each had her own story, her own reason for being there. None had known the others before this trip, having met through a travel group specializing in experiences for solo women over 50. We're part of a growing demographic. Helen told me over dinner one evening. Women our age who are discovering or rediscovering travel on their own terms. Some of us never had the chance before, some are reclaiming it after loss or change. Their friendship and the shared adventure healed something in me that I hadn't realized was still broken. With them, I wasn't poor Denise, the deceived wife. I was just Denise, a fellow traveler discovering the joy of new experiences. We parted with promises to keep in touch and tentative plans for another trip the following year. Returning to my coastal cottage after Italy, I felt different. The betrayal was still part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I started a book club specifically for women going through major life transitions, creating the supportive community I had needed during those early days after Frank's departure. 8 months after moving to the coast, I ran into Thomas Edwards at the local farmers market. Thomas had been the school district's maintenance supervisor during my years as a librarian. Now, widowed for 3 years, he had retired to the same coastal area to be near his daughter and grandchildren. We recognized each other instantly, and his genuine delight at seeing me warmed something that had been cold for too long. He invited me to join him for coffee, and we spent hours catching up. Thomas had known me professionally for decades, but had no connection to Frank or our social circle in Portland. His perspective was untainted by knowledge of the scandal. Our coffee meeting led to lunch the following week, then to my inviting him to a meeting of my book club, which occasionally included male guests. Thomas became a regular presence in my life, a friend whose company I genuinely enjoyed without expectation or pressure. 6 months into this renewed friendship, Thomas asked if I would accompany him to his granddaughter's school recital. Not as a date, he clarified, looking suddenly shy. Unless you want it to be. That evening marked a turning point. Watching Thomas beam with pride as his granddaughter performed, I realized I was smiling too genuinely happy for this kind man and his family. Later, when he hesitantly took my hand as we walked to the car, I didn't pull away. I was learning to trust again, one small step at a time. My relationship with Thomas developed slowly, built on honest conversation and mutual respect. He knew my story, having heard it from me directly rather than through gossip. His patience as I navigated my lingering trust issues was a constant reassurance. We have time, he would say whenever I needed to step back. There's no rush. 2 years after finding Frank's hidden album, I received a thick envelope from Julia. Inside was a check for a substantial amount and a short note. Your portion of the proceeds from the sale of the Bordeaux property. I know this doesn't make anything right, but it legally belongs to you as part of the marital assets. I donated the entire amount to a scholarship fund for young women pursuing higher education, turning the final remnant of that deception into something positive. The anger that had sustained me through the divorce gradually transformed into something more nuanced. I wouldn't call it forgiveness exactly, but rather a releasing. I no longer spent energy hating Frank or Julia. Their choices had shaped my life in profound and painful ways, but dwelling on that pain only gave them continued power over me. Dr. Marshall helped me understand that moving forward didn't mean denying what had happened or its impact on me. Healing doesn't mean you forget or excuse, she explained. It means you refuse to let the betrayal determine your future happiness. At 70, I looked at my life with new clarity. The 40 years with Frank had not been wasted time despite the lies at their core. I had found fulfillment in my career, made meaningful connections with students and colleagues, and developed strengths I never knew I possessed. The betrayal had not erased those accomplishments or experiences. What I learned through this painful journey was that it's never too late to reclaim your life. At an age when many people believe their stories are largely written, I discovered that mine had chapters yet to be composed, and I alone would write them. I thought finding that album was the end of my life, but it was actually the beginning. At 68, I finally started living for myself instead of for a lie. If you've experienced betrayal or loss, remember that your story doesn't end there. It's simply taking an unexpected turn towards something that might be even more authentic and fulfilling than what came before. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed your understanding of your past, Share your experience in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more journeys of resilience and renewal. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to begin again.